The sun was just beginning to rise over the hills when Grace stepped off the bus. She carried a small brown bag with everything she owned inside. Her shoes were old but clean, polished the night before. Grace looked up at the giant iron gates in front of her. Behind those gates stood the biggest house she had ever seen. This was the home of David Lennox, one of the richest men in the country. Grace took a deep breath and walked toward the entrance. The security guard looked at her from head to toe. "You must be the new maid," he said without smiling. Grace nodded politely. "Yes, sir, I am Grace. I start work today." He pressed a button and the gates slowly opened. Grace walked down the long driveway, her heart beating fast. The mansion had tall white columns and huge windows that sparkled in the morning light. She had cleaned houses before, but nothing like this. Inside, the head housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, was waiting. She was a short woman with glasses and a strict face. "You're late," Mrs. Chen said sharply. Grace checked her watch. She was actually 5 minutes early. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Grace replied quietly. She had learned long ago that arguing never helped Mrs. Chen handed her a uniform and showed her to a small room. "Change quickly. There's much work to do." Grace put on the black and white uniform. It was a bit too big, but she didn't complain. She tied her hair back and looked at herself in the small mirror. "You can do this," she whispered to herself. Grace had worked hard jobs before. She had crossed oceans and borders to find work. Her family back home needed the money she would send. That was all that mattered. Mrs. Chen led Grace through the mansion. Each room was bigger than Grace's entire childhood home. There were paintings on the walls that looked very expensive. The floors were made of marble that reflected like mirrors. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings. "Mr. Lennox is very particular about cleanliness," Mrs. Chen warned. "He notices everything, and he does not accept mistakes." Grace nodded, paying attention to every word. The other staff members barely looked at Grace when she passed. She could feel their eyes judging her. Some whispered to each other when she walked by. Grace pretended not to notice. She had experienced this before in other places. Being the new person was always difficult. Being different made it even harder. Around mid-morning, Grace finally saw Mr. David Lennox. He was a tall man in an expensive suit. His watch probably cost more than Grace would earn in 10 years. He was talking loudly on his phone as he walked down the stairs. Grace stepped aside to let him pass. She kept her eyes down respectfully, but David stopped and looked at her. "Who are you?" he asked. His tone was not friendly. "I am Grace, sir, the new maid." David looked at her uniform and frowned. "Where are you from?" he asked. "I came from Africa, sir, but I have worked in many places." David laughed. But it was not a kind laugh. "Africa, well, just make sure you know how things work here." He walked away, still chuckling to himself. Grace felt her face grow warm. She had heard that tone many times before. Throughout the day, Grace worked harder than anyone else. She cleaned the library until every book was dust-free. She polished the silverware until it shined. She organized the kitchen pantry perfectly. The other staff watched her with mixed feelings. Some seemed impressed by her dedication. Others seemed worried she would make them look bad. By evening, Grace's back ached and her feet hurt. But she didn't stop. Mrs. Chen inspected her work with a critical eye. To Grace's relief, the older woman nodded slightly. "Acceptable," was all she said. For Mrs. Chen, that was high praise. That night, Grace returned to the tiny room she had been given. It was in the servants' quarters, far from the main house. She sat on the small bed and took out her phone. There was a message from her mother back home. Her younger brother needed school fees. Her sister needed medicine. Grace calculated her salary in her head. It would be enough, but barely. She would have to work extra hours when possible. As she lay down to sleep, Grace heard laughter coming from the main house. Mr. Lennox was having dinner with important-looking guests. Through her small window, she could see the lights and shadows. Grace closed her eyes. She thought about her education, her languages, her dreams. No one here knew her story. No one knew what she had studied or where she had been. To them, she was just a maid, just someone to clean and serve. But Grace knew something they didn't. Her time would come. One day they would see her differently. She just had to be patient and wait for the right moment. 3 weeks had passed since Grace arrived at the mansion. She had become part of the invisible workforce that kept the house running. Every morning she woke before sunrise. Every night she returned to her room after everyone else had gone to bed. The work was endless, but Grace never complained. She moved through the halls like a ghost, silent and efficient. David Lennox had barely spoken to her since that first day. When he did notice her, it was usually to point out something he didn't like. "The flowers in my office are dying," he would say. "The windows have streaks," he would complain. Grace would simply nod and fix whatever he mentioned. She learned to anticipate his needs before he even asked. But David seemed to enjoy making her uncomfortable. One morning, he was having breakfast with his business partners. Grace was refilling their coffee cups. Her hand trembled slightly and a tiny drop spilled on the table. David's eyes lit up with cruel amusement. "Careful there," he said loudly. "We can't afford any accidents today." His guests laughed politely. Grace quickly wiped the drop and apologized. "Where did you say you learned to serve?" David asked mockingly. "I have worked in hotels, sir," Grace replied quietly. "Well, those must have been very forgiving hotels," he laughed. The other men joined in the laughter. Grace kept her face neutral and continued her work. Later that day, Mrs. Chen called all the staff together. Her expression was even more serious than usual. "Mr. Lennox has an important announcement," she said. David walked into the room with a huge smile on his face. "He was holding a glass of champagne. I wanted you all to know," he began, "that next month we're hosting the biggest event this house has ever seen." The staff exchanged nervous glances. Big events meant more work and more stress. "I'm finalizing a $6 billion deal," David continued proudly. "Investors from 9 different countries will be coming here." He paused for dramatic effect. "This deal will make me one of the most powerful businessmen in the world." Some staff members clapped politely. Grace listened carefully from the back of the room. "I expect perfection," David said, his tone turning cold. "This house must look immaculate. The food must be flawless, everything must be perfect." His eyes scanned the room and landed on Grace. "And I mean everyone must be on their best behavior." The message was clear. After the meeting, the atmosphere in the mansion changed completely. The staff was anxious and tense. Mrs. Chen created detailed schedules and lists. Everyone would work double shifts to prepare. Some of the older staff members began to worry. "What if something goes wrong?" they whispered. "Mr. Lennox will fire us all," another replied. Grace noticed something else too. Some of the staff had started to resent her. Maria, who had worked there for 5 years, barely spoke to her anymore. "You work too hard," Maria said one day, her voice sharp. "You make the rest of us look bad." Grace was confused. "I'm just doing my job," she replied gently. "Well, some of us have families and can't work like machines," Maria snapped. Grace wanted to say that she also had a family, that she also got tired, but she stayed silent. Making enemies would only make things harder. As the days passed, Grace overheard more and more conversations. David was on the phone constantly, speaking in English to various people. She heard names of countries and cities: China, Russia, France, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Japan, Germany, South Africa, Italy. These were the investors coming to the mansion. Grace's heart began to beat faster when she heard these names. She knew something that nobody else knew. One evening, Grace was cleaning David's office. "He was on a video call with his team, sir." "About the language barrier," someone on the screen said. "Should we hire professional interpreters?" David waved his hand dismissively. "That's too expensive and too complicated," he said. "Most of these people speak some English." "But, sir, the technical details of the contract," the person tried to continue. "I said no," David interrupted firmly. "We'll manage just fine. I can be very charming." He ended the call and didn't notice Grace in the corner. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She thought about the upcoming event. She thought about the investors from 9 countries. Grace had grown up in a diplomatic family in Africa. Her father had worked for the United Nations. She had lived in 7 countries before she turned 18. She had attended international schools. She spoke 9 languages fluently: English, French, Arabic, Mandarin, Russian, Portuguese, Swahili, German, and Italian. But nobody here knew that. Nobody had asked about her education or her background. They only saw Maid. Grace took out an old photograph from her bag. It showed her at university, wearing a graduation gown. She had studied international relations and linguistics. But then her father had died suddenly. The family lost everything. Grace had to leave her career behind and find work anywhere she could. She had sent money home for 2 years now. Her pride had been hurt many times, but her family's survival was more important than her ego. As she put the photo away, Grace heard loud voices from the main house. David was on the phone again, shouting at someone. I don't care what it takes, he yelled. This deal must go through. My entire reputation depends on this. Grace could hear the desperation in his voice. She realized that David Lennox was not as confident as he pretended to be. He was afraid, and when powerful men are afraid, they often make big mistakes. Grace closed her eyes and made a decision. She would stay quiet and wait. Sometimes the right opportunity comes when you least expect it. And when it came, she would be ready. The mansion had transformed into a war zone of preparation. Decorators arrived with expensive flowers and silk curtains. Chefs tested elaborate dishes in the kitchen. Security personnel walked the grounds with serious faces. Every corner of the house was being polished and perfected. The big day was only 1 week away. Grace worked 16-hour shifts without a single break. Her hands were raw from scrubbing and cleaning, but she never showed any weakness. She watched everything happening around her with quiet attention. While others complained about the extra work, Grace listened and learned. David had become even more unbearable than before. He snapped at everyone who crossed his path. The chandelier isn't bright enough, he would shout. The marble floors should shine like mirrors, he demanded. Everything must be absolutely perfect, he repeated constantly. The pressure was destroying everyone's nerves. 2 staff members had already quit. Mrs. Chen looked exhausted and pale. One afternoon, Grace was dusting the hallway near David's private study. The door was slightly open. She could hear David inside with his lawyer and chief financial officer. Gentlemen, let me be clear, David said, his voice tense. If this deal falls through, we're finished. Grace's hand stopped moving. She stood very still and listened. The company has massive debts, the lawyer said quietly. We've borrowed heavily to finance this expansion. I know that, David snapped. That's why these investors are our only hope, the CFO spoke up nervously. Sir, what concerns me is the communication aspect. These investors come from completely different backgrounds. Their cultures, their business practices, even their sense of humor is different. One wrong word could offend someone and destroy everything. David laughed, but it sounded forced and fake. You worry too much, he said. I've closed billion-dollar deals before. But sir, the lawyer interrupted, you've never dealt with this many. International parties at once, the Chinese. Delegation is very formal. The Russian investors are extremely direct. The Arab businessmen have specific cultural expectations. And the French representatives are known for being very particular about respect and protocol. There was a long silence. Grace could imagine David's face turning red. Are you suggesting I can't handle this? He asked coldly. No, sir, both men said quickly. We're just suggesting we bring in language and cultural experts. Absolutely not, David responded firmly. That would make me look weak and unprepared. I will handle this my way. The meeting ended abruptly. Grace quickly moved away before anyone saw her. Her mind was racing with everything she had heard. David's entire empire was built on borrowed money and big promises. If this deal failed, he would lose everything. The mansion, the cars, the lifestyle, all of it would disappear. And everyone who worked here would lose their jobs too. That evening, Grace was serving dinner to David and his girlfriend Melissa. Melissa was a young model who loved expensive things. She was scrolling through her phone, barely paying attention to David. Darling, after this deal closes, we should buy that villa in Monaco, she said. David smiled weakly. Of course, anything you want. Melissa didn't notice the fear in his eyes. But Grace did as Grace poured wine into their glasses. David's phone rang. He looked at the screen and his face went white. I need to take this, he said, standing up quickly. He walked to the balcony and answered. Grace continued setting the table. But she could hear his voice rising. What do you mean they're having second thoughts? He shouted. No, that's unacceptable. Tell them everything is arranged. Tell them this will be the most professional event they've ever attended. Grace glanced at Melissa. The young woman was still focused on her phone. Completely unaware, Grace understood something in that moment. David was completely alone in his fear. Nobody around him truly understood what he was facing. They only saw his money and his power. They didn't see the desperate man beneath the expensive suit. The next few days were chaos. David became more paranoid and controlling. He checked every detail himself. He criticized everything the staff did. This tablecloth has a wrinkle, he would point out. These glasses aren't arranged symmetrically, he would complain. Why does the garden fountain sound too loud? He would ask, nothing was ever good enough. Grace observed how David practiced greetings in different languages. He would stand in front of the mirror saying simple phrases. Bonjour, he would say with a terrible accent. Konnichiwa, he would mangle completely. Zdravstvuyte, he couldn't even pronounce. It was painful to watch. Grace knew he was going to embarrass himself. And worse, he was going to offend very powerful people. One morning, Grace was cleaning the guest rooms. Each room had been assigned to a different delegation. She saw the nameplates on the doors: Chinese delegation, Russian Federation, Saudi Arabian representatives, French investors, Brazilian partners, German consortium, Japanese executives, South African group, Italian financiers. Grace's heart began to pound. She had lived in countries where all these languages were spoken. She had studied with people from these cultures. She understood their customs, their values, their expectations. But she was just a maid. Nobody would listen to her. Nobody would take her seriously. David had made it clear what he thought of her. Why should she help him? Grace thought about her family back home. If David's company collapsed, she would be out of work. Finding another job wouldn't be easy, but there was something else bothering her. Grace had been raised to use her talents to help others. Her father had always said, "Knowledge is a gift meant to be shared." Even when people had treated her badly, even when they had looked down on her, she had never used her abilities to hurt them. Grace stood in the hallway between all those guest room doors. She closed her eyes and made a promise to herself. She would not interfere unless it became absolutely necessary. If David could somehow manage on his own, fine. But if things fell apart, if the deal was about to collapse, if there was no other choice, then she would step forward, not for David's sake, but for all the innocent people who would suffer if his empire crumbled. For Mrs. Chen, for the kitchen staff, for the gardeners, for everyone who depended on this place for survival, Grace would be ready when the moment came. The morning of the event arrived with perfect weather. The sky was clear and blue. Birds sang in the carefully manicured gardens. But inside the mansion, everyone was holding their breath. This was the day that would change everything. Grace had been awake since 3 a.m. She had helped prepare the grand ballroom. Every surface gleamed under the crystal chandeliers. The tables were set with gold-rimmed plates and sterling silver. Fresh flowers filled every room with sweet fragrance. Everything looked like a picture from a luxury magazine. David appeared at 7 wearing a custom-made Italian suit. He looked confident on the outside, but Grace noticed his hands shaking slightly. He kept checking his phone every few minutes. "Is everything ready?" he asked Mrs. Chen for the 10th time. "Yes, sir." "Everything is perfect," she replied patiently. The first guests arrived at noon. Black limousines and luxury cars pulled up to the mansion. Grace watched from a second-floor window. Men and women in expensive clothes stepped out. They looked around with evaluating eyes. These were people who had seen everything money could buy. Impressing them would not be easy. The Chinese delegation arrived first. 5 serious-looking businessmen in dark suits. They bowed slightly when greeting David. He tried to bow back but looked awkward and unsure. "Ni hao," David said with a thick accent. The Chinese visitors smiled politely but said nothing. Grace could see the confusion in their eyes. Next came the Russian investors, 3 tall men with stern faces. They shook David's hand with grips that looked painful. "Welcome, welcome," David said enthusiastically. He tried to say something in Russian but completely butchered it. One of the Russians raised an eyebrow. Another whispered something to his colleague. They were not impressed. The other delegations arrived one by one. The elegant French group with their sophisticated manner. The warm Brazilian partners who smiled and laughed. The punctual German consortium who checked their watches. The respectful Japanese executives who bowed formally. The dignified Saudi Arabian representatives in traditional dress. The friendly South African team. The stylish Italian financiers. David greeted each group with forced enthusiasm. He tried to say hello in each language, but every attempt was worse than the last. "Bonjour, mes amis," he said to the French, mispronouncing every word. "Ciao, Bella," he said to the Italian men, which was completely inappropriate. "Konbanwa," he said to the Japanese, even though it was afternoon. Grace watched it all from her position near the serving stations. She felt embarrassed for him. More importantly, she saw the investors exchanging concerned glances. The cocktail hour began in the garden. Waiters moved through the crowd with champagne and appetizers. Grace was among them, invisible in her uniform. She moved close to different groups, listening carefully. The Chinese delegation was speaking Mandarin among themselves. "This house is impressive, but is the owner competent?" one asked. "He seems disorganized," another replied. "Perhaps we should reconsider this investment," the senior member suggested. Grace moved to where the Russian investors stood. They were speaking Russian in low voices. "He doesn't understand protocol," one said. "This is not serious business," another agreed. "We should leave before we waste more time," the third concluded. The French representatives were speaking French near the fountain. "Mon Dieu, this man has no cultural awareness," one woman said. "How can we trust someone who doesn't respect basic courtesy?" her colleague asked. "I feel insulted," another added. Grace's heart sank. The party had barely started and already the investors wanted to leave. David had no idea what was happening. He was moving through the crowd with a big smile, thinking everything was going perfectly. But Grace could see the truth. The deal was already falling apart. Inside the ballroom, lunch was being served. David had arranged the seating very carefully. He sat at the head of the table. The different delegations were mixed together. David probably thought this would encourage conversation, but it had the opposite effect. People from different countries sat in uncomfortable silence. They couldn't communicate with each other. They smiled politely but said nothing meaningful. David stood up to make a speech. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began confidently, "thank you for traveling so far to be here today." He spoke only in English. Most people understood some of it, but the nuances and details were lost. He made jokes that nobody laughed at. He used business terms that confused people. He talked about vision and partnership, but his words felt empty without proper translation. Grace stood against the wall with other servers. She understood every word David said. She also understood what the investors were saying to each other. The Arabic speakers were discussing how disrespectful this was. The Germans were commenting on the lack of professionalism. The Brazilians were wondering if they should just go home. The Japanese were too polite to complain but looked deeply uncomfortable. Mrs. Chen approached Grace quietly. "Something feels wrong," she whispered. "The guests don't seem happy." Grace nodded slowly. "They're not," she replied softly, "but why?" "Everything is perfect, Mrs. Chen said, confused. Grace wanted to explain. But before she could say anything, David called for attention. "Now," David announced proudly, "let's discuss the details of our partnership." He had someone bring out folders with contracts. "These documents outline our agreement," he continued. "I'm sure you'll find everything in order." He handed folders to each delegation. But there was a problem. All the contracts were only in English. The complex legal and financial terms were impossible for non-native speakers to understand. Grace saw the expressions change around the room. The Chinese delegation looked insulted. The Russians looked angry. The French stood up from their seats. The Germans checked their phones. The Saudis whispered urgently among themselves. This was a disaster. David finally seemed to notice something was wrong. His smile faded, his confidence cracked. The room fell into tense silence, and Grace realized the moment she had been waiting for was about to arrive. The tension in the ballroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. David stood at the head of the table looking confused and panicked. The investors were shifting in their seats uncomfortably. Some were already reaching for their phones. Others were whispering to their assistants. This was not going according to plan. The senior member of the Chinese delegation stood up slowly. He said something in Mandarin to his colleagues. They all nodded and began gathering their papers. David's eyes went wide with alarm. "Wait, please, where are you going?" he asked desperately. The Chinese businessman tried to explain in broken English. "Contract, we no understand, very complicated. This not professional. We expected translation." His words were simple, but his meaning was crystal clear. They felt disrespected and were preparing to leave. Before David could respond, one of the Russian investors also stood. He spoke in rapid Russian to his partners. They looked angry and disappointed. "You invite us here but no Russian documents?" He said in heavily accented English. "This is waste of our time. In Russia, serious business means preparation. You are not prepared." The other Russians nodded in agreement. The French delegation looked at each other with raised eyebrows. The lead investor, a woman named Madame Beaumont, spoke up. "Monsieur Lennox," she said coldly, "in France, we value respect and attention to detail. You have shown neither. We cannot invest $6 billion based on documents we cannot fully understand." She said something in French to her team. They all stood up and began moving toward the door. David's face had gone from red to pale white. Sweat appeared on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Please, everyone, please sit down," he begged. "We can work this out, I can explain everything." But his words sounded hollow and desperate. The German investors were checking their watches. The Japanese executives looked deeply uncomfortable. The Brazilians were speaking Portuguese among themselves. The Saudis had stopped eating and sat in dignified silence. Mrs. Chen looked terrified from her position near the kitchen. The other staff members were frozen, not knowing what to do. This elegant party was turning into a complete catastrophe. Years of planning and millions of dollars were evaporating in minutes. David's entire empire was crumbling right before everyone's eyes. One of the German investors stood and addressed David directly. "Herr Lennox, we Germans value efficiency and clarity. This situation is neither efficient nor clear. We expected professional interpreters and translated materials. Without these basic courtesies, we cannot proceed." He said something in German to his colleagues. They began packing their briefcases. David tried one more time. "Please, if you'll just give me a moment to arrange translators," but the damage was already done. The Italian financiers were also standing now. They spoke rapidly in Italian, clearly frustrated. The South African team looked sympathetic but also disappointed. Even the polite Japanese delegation was preparing to leave. The Saudi Arabian representative, Sheikh Abdullah, finally spoke. He addressed David in careful but accented English. "Mr. Lennox, in our culture, hospitality means anticipating your guests' needs. You have invited people from 9 countries, yet you have prepared only for English speakers. Damn, this shows a lack of wisdom and foresight. How can we trust you with our money if you cannot manage a simple meeting?" His words were not angry, but they cut deeper than any shouting could. David looked around the room desperately. His lawyer and CFO stood in the corner looking helpless. They had warned him this would happen, but his pride had prevented him from listening. Now he was paying the price. "Wait, everyone, please. Just wait." David's voice was shaking now, but people were already moving toward the exits. The Chinese delegation reached the ballroom doors first. The Russians were right behind them. The French group was gathering their designer handbags. David's girlfriend, Melissa, sat at a side table looking bored and confused. She had no idea what was happening. She was still scrolling through her phone. Mrs. Chen approached David quickly. "Sir, what should we do?" she whispered urgently. David had no answer. For the first time in his life, his charm and confidence had failed him. Money couldn't solve this problem. Expensive champagne couldn't fix this situation. The beautiful mansion couldn't impress anyone if they couldn't communicate. Grace had been standing perfectly still near the serving station. She had watched every moment of the disaster unfold. Her heart was racing, but her face remained calm. She knew exactly what each delegation had said. She understood every complaint and every frustration. She could fix this, but should she? Part of her wanted to let David fail. He had mocked her accent and her background. He had treated her as less than human. He had laughed at where she came from. Why should she save him now? But then Grace looked at Mrs. Chen's frightened face. She thought about the kitchen staff who had families to feed. She remembered the gardeners and cleaners who depended on their jobs. If David's company collapsed, hundreds of innocent people would suffer. Grace also thought about her father's words. Your abilities are not just for yourself. When you have knowledge that others don't, you have a responsibility. Use your gifts to build bridges, not walls. Her father had devoted his life to bringing people together. Could she do any less? Grace took a deep breath. Her hands were trembling, but her mind was clear. She had spent years being invisible, years of being overlooked and underestimated. But this moment required her to be seen. This moment required courage. She set down the tray she was holding. She smoothed her uniform. She straightened her shoulders. And then Grace began walking toward David. Every eye in the room would soon be on her. Every assumption about who she was would be shattered. The invisible maid was about to become impossible to ignore. Grace's secret was about to change everything. Grace walked across the ballroom floor. Her footsteps echoed in the tense silence. Everyone turned to look at the maid moving toward the center of the room. David saw her approaching, and his face showed confusion and annoyance. "Not now," he hissed at her quietly. "Can't you see we're in the middle of something?" But Grace didn't stop walking. She reached David and spoke softly so only he could hear. "Mr. Lennox, I can help you." David looked at her like she had lost her mind. "Help? What are you talking about?" He whispered harshly. "I can translate," Grace said calmly. "I speak all their languages." David stared at her in disbelief. "What? That's impossible," he said. "You're just—" He stopped himself. But Grace knew what he was going to say. "You're just a maid." The Chinese delegation was already at the door. There was no time for David's doubt. Grace turned away from him. She faced the Chinese businessman. And then she spoke in perfect Mandarin. Her voice was clear and confident. "尊敬的先生们，请等一下," she said. The words flowed naturally like water from a spring. The Chinese delegation stopped immediately. They turned around in complete shock. The senior member's mouth fell open. Grace continued in Mandarin. She apologized for the disorganization. She acknowledged their concerns with respect and understanding. She explained that there had been a terrible miscommunication. She asked them to please return to the table. She promised that everything would be properly translated. The Chinese businessmen looked at each other in amazement. Grace's Mandarin was not just correct, it was elegant and cultured. She used the formal phrases appropriate for respected elders. She showed the exact level of respect their culture demanded. Slowly, almost in a daze, they walked back to their seats. Before anyone could react, Grace turned to the Russian investors. She spoke to them in flawless Russian. Her accent was perfect. She addressed their concerns about professionalism. She spoke with the directness that Russian business culture values. No flowery words, just honest acknowledgement of the mistakes. The Russians' angry expressions softened. They looked at Grace with new respect. They returned to their seats without argument. The entire ballroom was now completely silent. Everyone was staring at Grace in absolute disbelief. David's mouth was hanging open. Mrs. Chen looked like she might faint. The other staff members were frozen in shock. Who was this woman? Grace turned to the French delegation. Madame Beaumont was watching her with intense curiosity. Grace spoke in beautiful French. Her pronunciation was Parisian perfect. She apologized with the eloquence that French culture appreciates. She used sophisticated vocabulary that showed deep education. She acknowledged the insult they had felt. She asked for the opportunity to correct this terrible oversight. Madame Beaumont's stern expression melted into a surprised smile. "Mais c'est incroyable," she whispered. The French team returned to their seats, now intrigued. Grace moved through the room like a conductor leading an orchestra. She spoke to the German delegation in precise German. She addressed the Brazilian partners in warm Portuguese. She greeted the Japanese executives with proper Japanese honorifics. She spoke to Sheikh Abdullah in respectful Arabic. She conversed with the South Africans in their preferred English. She charmed the Italians with musical Italian. Each time she switched languages, the room gasped. It was like watching magic happen. Grace didn't just translate words. She understood the cultural context behind each language. She knew when to be formal and when to be warm. She knew which gestures to make and which to avoid. She transformed the chaos into harmony within minutes. All the investors had returned to their seats. They were no longer angry or insulted. They were fascinated and impressed. They began asking Grace questions. Where had she learned their languages? Where was she from? What was her background? Grace answered each question with grace and humility. She explained about her father's diplomatic career. She talked about living in 7 countries. She mentioned her university degree in international relations. She told them about her linguistic studies. The investors listened with growing amazement. David stood completely frozen. His brain couldn't process what was happening. The woman he had mocked and dismissed, the person he had treated as invisible, was saving his entire future, his $6 billion deal. His company, his reputation, everything was in her hands now. One of the Chinese businessmen spoke to David, "Mr. Lennox. Why did you not tell us you had such a talented person on your team?" David's face turned red. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Grace looked at him calmly. There was no anger in her eyes. No desire for revenge, just quiet dignity, "Mr. Lennox is a very busy man," Grace said diplomatically. "Sometimes important details are overlooked. But now we can move forward properly." She turned to address all the investors. "If you permit me, I will translate the contract documents. I will explain each section in your native languages. I will make sure everyone understands every detail. And I will help facilitate your discussions with Mr. Lennox, the investors looked at each other and nodded. The German representative spoke up. Young lady, if you can do what you promise, then perhaps this meeting can be saved, Sheikh Abdullah added. Your knowledge and respect have impressed us all, Madame Beaumont smiled. Finally, someone with proper education and manners. Grace picked up the contract documents. She pulled a chair to the center of the room, and she began to work for the next 3 hours. She translated every word. She explained every clause. She answered every question in 9 different languages. The investors who had been ready to walk out were now engaged and interested. The deal that had been dead was coming back to life. And David Lennox stood watching, finally understanding how wrong he had been about everything. The sun was setting outside the mansion windows, casting golden light across the ballroom. Grace had been translating for hours without a break. Her voice remained steady and clear, but her throat was getting dry and her legs were tired. Still, she never showed any weakness. The atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. What had been tense and hostile was now warm and collaborative. The Chinese delegation was smiling and nodding. The Russians were making jokes that Grace translated perfectly. The French were impressed by the attention to detail. Every investor was now engaged and interested. Grace explained a complex financial clause to the German consortium. She switched to Portuguese to clarify a timeline with the Brazilians. She used Japanese to discuss risk management with the Tokyo executives. She spoke Arabic to address Sheikh Abdullah's concerns about ethical practices. Each conversation flowed naturally. It was like watching a master artist at work. The investors began talking not just to David, but to each other. Grace facilitated conversations between groups. The Chinese and Germans discussed manufacturing. The Russians and Brazilians talked about natural resources. The French and Italians shared thoughts on luxury markets. Grace made it all possible. She was the bridge connecting 9 different worlds. During a brief pause, Madame Beaumont approached Grace. My dear, you are extraordinary, she said in French. Grace smiled and replied in the same language. I am just doing what I was trained to do. No, Madame Beaumont insisted. You are doing far more than that. You have dignity and grace under pressure. These are qualities that cannot be taught. Sheikh Abdullah also came to speak with Grace. He addressed her in Arabic with deep respect. Your father must have been a great man to raise such a daughter. Grace's eyes became slightly moist. He was, she replied softly in Arabic. He taught me that knowledge should serve humanity, that we should use our gifts to bring people together. The sheikh nodded with approval. He taught you well. Even the serious Russian investors warmed to Grace. One of them asked her in Russian, why are you working as a maid with such education? Grace paused before answering honestly. Life does not always go as we plan. My father died and my family needed support. I took the work that was available. There is no shame in honest work. The Russian man's expression softened. You have the strength of a true survivor, he said with respect. David watched all of this from the side. His lawyer and CFO were also observing in amazement. Did you know about her? The lawyer whispered. David shook his head slowly. I had no idea, he admitted quietly. I never asked. I never looked beyond the uniform, his CFO spoke carefully. She's not just saving the deal. She's making it better than it would have been with professional translators. She understands business, not just language. It was true. Grace wasn't just translating words mechanically. She was clarifying concepts. She was anticipating questions before they were asked. She was smoothing over cultural misunderstandings. She was adding value at every moment. The investors trusted her completely. As evening approached, the contracts were finally ready. Grace had worked with each delegation to ensure they understood everything. She had suggested small modifications that respected different cultural concerns. She had helped David communicate his vision properly. The deal that had been impossible was now within reach. The signing ceremony began. One by one, the delegations came forward. The Chinese signed with ceremonial brushes Grace had suggested providing. The Russians appreciated the vodka toast Grace had recommended. The French enjoyed the classical music playing softly that Grace had arranged. Each cultural touch showed respect and consideration. These were details David would never have thought of. When the last signature was placed on the contracts, the room erupted in applause. The $6 billion deal was complete. David's company was saved. His empire would continue, all because of Grace. David walked to the center of the room. His hands were shaking slightly. He looked at Grace with an expression she had never seen before. It was humility mixed with shame and gratitude, ladies and gentlemen, he announced. I need to say something important. The room became quiet. Everyone turned to listen. David took a deep breath. Today I learned a lesson I will never forget. I was arrogant and blind. I dismissed someone extraordinary because I judged only by appearance. His voice cracked with emotion. Grace, I owe you an apology. Treated you with disrespect and cruelty. I laughed. At you when I should have listened. I ignored you when I should have valued. You had every reason to let me fail today, but instead, you saved me. The ballroom was absolutely silent. Every person was watching this moment. Grace stood quietly. Maintaining her composure, David continued. I don't deserve your help or your forgiveness, but I'm asking for both, and I want everyone here to know that Grace is no longer a maid in this house. Starting tomorrow, she will be the Director of International Relations for my company, with a salary that reflects her true value and my personal commitment to support her family. Tears began rolling down Grace's cheeks, but she was smiling. The staff members were crying too, Mrs. Chen was wiping her eyes with her apron. The investors stood and applauded. They surrounded Grace, shaking her hand and congratulating her. Sheikh Abdullah said something that made everyone listen. Today we witnessed something rare. We saw talent triumph over prejudice. We saw dignity overcome disrespect. This is a good omen for our partnership. The party continued late into the night. But now it was a genuine celebration. Grace was no longer invisible. She was the star of the evening, and her life was about to change forever. After the deal was signed, the atmosphere in the mansion changed forever. Grace awoke the next morning not as a maid but as an executive. Her uniform was replaced by a crisp business suit. She took the elevator upstairs for the first time, not to clean but to join the board meeting. Every staff member greeted her with admiration and respect. Even those who had once ignored her now smiled warmly. The news of her incredible feat had spread beyond the walls of the mansion. David Lennox's guests told the story in business circles and social clubs soon. Newspapers published articles about the maid who saved a billionaire. Business magazines requested interviews. Grace's name trended online. Her photo, standing beside the international delegations, went viral. Grace felt proud and grateful, but also overwhelmed by attention. David followed through on his promises. He wrote a personal letter to Grace's family, thanking them for raising a remarkable woman. He arranged for her siblings' school fees and medicine expenses. He invited Grace's mother for a visit and introduced her with honor at a staff dinner. Grace's family was filled with joy and pride. Her younger brother sent a voice message that made Grace cry with happiness. You are my hero, he said. Grace smiled through her tears. She knew her father would have been proud. Grace's role at the company was more than just a title. She built a team of language and culture experts. She started a new training program called Respect Beyond Borders. She helped staff understand cultural sensitivity and language basics. Her workshops were attended by everyone from secretaries to senior partners. Grace showed that little gestures like a proper greeting or respecting traditions could change everything. Employees from all backgrounds felt more included. The company flourished with new international deals. Investors from other countries felt comfortable working with them. Profits grew, but so did respect and reputation. David changed too. He became humble, listening to his employees with real interest. He promoted diversity and fairness for all staff. Gone were the days of cruel jokes and dismissive attitudes. Whenever a new employee joined, David insisted on learning about their background. He told the story of how he was saved by someone he had once overlooked. It became a lesson for others. No one inside the company would ever judge someone by their job title or appearance again. Grace was often invited to speak at conferences and universities. She encouraged young people to work hard and never be ashamed of their roots. She shared her story of rising from hardship to success. She explained how dignity and kindness could turn enemies into friends. Her talks inspired many students, especially girls, to pursue education and international careers. Other companies contacted her for advice on building diverse teams and breaking down barriers. She became a mentor to dozens of aspiring professionals. But even as her life changed, Grace never forgot where she came from. She started a foundation to support children from low-income families. She funded scholarships for youth who spoke multiple languages. She volunteered at community centers, teaching language and cultural skills. Her weekends were spent helping those who struggled as she once had. Grace made sure the door she had opened would stay open for others. Her story appeared in documentaries and books. The message was clear. Talent is everywhere if you just look for it. Late one evening, Grace sat in her office overlooking the city lights. David stopped by smiling. "Thank you for saving us all." "Grace," he said. Grace nodded and smiled. "I didn't do it alone," she replied. "Everyone here helped." David shook his head. "You gave us a new way to see the world," he said gently. "We can never repay you." Grace opened her window and listened to the sounds of the city. She thought about the journey that had brought her here. From a tiny village to the boardroom of a global corporation, from a forgotten maid to a respected leader. She remembered her father's words, "Build bridges, not walls." Grace knew her story was proof that kindness and knowledge can change the course of lives. She had faced prejudice and hardship. She had chosen courage over bitterness. Now she stood at the beginning of a new future. Her heart was full of hope, and as she looked out at the night sky, Grace knew that her story, like her journey, was just beginning.